Imagine a world where every drop of blood matters, and there is a child who does not fit the ideal. What will happen to them? In the history of monarchies, where every detail of life was controlled, such children often fell victim to cruel traditions. In the dynasties of the past, the blood of the royal family did not simply signify belonging. It was a sacred symbol of power and almost divine strength. Every child born into the royal family had to live up to high expectations, perpetuating the myth of perfection, strength, and mental acuity. But what if that child was born with special characteristics, with eyes that did not meet the standards, or with developmental delays? Their existence became a threat not only to the honor of their parents, but also to the entire illusion of greatness that the monarchy had created over centuries. Within the cold walls of European and Asian palaces were nameless rooms where such children were hidden away. Their lives were erased from family trees. They had no portraits and did not celebrate birthdays. Some were sent to remote monasteries. Others were declared dead in official documents, although they continued to exist. They were not allowed to die, but they were not allowed to live either. In the eyes of the authorities, any deviation from the norm was considered an unforgivable sin. This is not just a tragedy. It is a reflection of a civilization that measured the value of life by criteria of visible perfection. Let us remember that in the history of monarchies, there were not only cruel traditions, but also deep ideologies. For example, in ancient China, the emperor was considered the son of heaven, the only link between the earthly and the heavenly. His body was sacred, and his offspring were untouchable. If one of the children was born with defects, it was perceived as divine punishment. Interestingly, Confucianism, while emphasizing the importance of compassion, also demanded perfect order. Thus, imperfection became a moral threat. In Europe, especially in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, purity of blood was not only a spiritual ideal, but also a legal norm. Royal houses practiced marriages between close relatives to preserve their lineage. However, this genetic isolationism had its consequences. For example, the Habsburg syndrome, which manifested itself in the form of a prominent jaw and neurological problems, became historical evidence of the price paid for purity of blood. When children with visible disabilities were born as a result of such marriages, society's reactions were cruel. Medicine at the time was primitive, and the church often reinforced the belief that disability was a sign of sin. Some chronicles of the time barely mention such children. They could be baptized and buried on the same day, or sent to monasteries where they lived without names or a future. In the Ottoman Empire, the harem system and strict control over inheritance created an even more closed atmosphere. Princes were watched from birth, taught by eunuchs, and isolated in special pavilions. It was a life full of fear and loneliness, where love and acceptance were unavailable. Thus, the story of these children is not just a page from the past, but a lesson that reminds us of the importance of valuing human life, regardless of its perfection. Imagine a world where weakness is not just a flaw, but a death sentence. In this cruel society, if someone showed signs of illness or developmental delays, they were quietly removed from the line of succession. Sometimes they were said to have fallen ill and died, and sometimes they simply disappeared from official records. In an empire where blood determined destiny, there was no place for those who could not wield a sword or deliver inspiring speeches. But the most disturbing aspect of this obsession with purity of blood was not only exclusion, but also silence. No trials, no debates, only secret decisions made in closed rooms filled with whispers. The death of an imperfect heir was not seen as a tragedy, but rather as a hidden correction. Thus, from generation to generation, an archive of absences accumulated. Children no one spoke of, daughters who were not presented at the royal court. Their lives were reduced to footnotes and crossings out in manuscripts. The fear did not come only from the differences, but from what those differences could mean for the people. If the king could give birth to the wrong child, did that not call into question the sanctity of his lineage? Did it not mean that his throne was tainted? The people must not suspect. The image of the monarchy had to remain flawless, and for that, the truth was sacrificed. The body of the heir became a canvas onto which the anxieties of the entire system were projected. In feudal Japan, emperors were considered descendants of the gods. But when a prince was born with signs of illness or retardation, he was immediately replaced by his brother. No official explanation was given, only a decree. The second son would be the heir. No one asked questions. No one sought answers. Official biographies were rewritten, portraits destroyed, and wet nurses sent away. These practices were not the exception. They were the norm. And although today this may seem shocking, in their context, they were considered necessary. The crown was not a symbol of love, but a tool of control and stability. Any weakness in the family was perceived as a political risk. In a world where wars could break out because of a prince's apparent incompetence, kings could not afford to have an heir who did not meet physical and intellectual standards. The saddest thing is that many of these children did not die. They lived. Some in monasteries, others in secluded rooms of the palace, surrounded by loyal servants but cut off from everything, without books, without a voice, without a name. They never received the crown, but they never found a full life either. Today, looking back, we ask ourselves, how many names are missing from the family trees? How many portraits were deliberately hidden? How many royal children lived and died in the shadows, simply because their existence called into question the myth of perfection? In this context, we understand that the pursuit of purity was not an act of love for the monarchy, but a betrayal of humanity. Every child erased, every life silenced, is a testament to how power, obsessed with its own image, can become blind to the true value of human life. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world seemed to be moving toward reason, science, and human rights. But even in the light of modernity, many shadows remained. Powerful families were still hostages to their myths, and children with genetic abnormalities such as Down syndrome continued to be perceived not as full lives, but as obstacles to the official narrative. The story of Nerisa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon begins not with scandal, but with silence. Nerisa was born in 1919 and Catherine in 1926. They were cousins of the future Queen Elizabeth II, part of the very heart of the British monarchy. But from an early age, their development deviated from the invisible protocol that determined how a noble girl should grow up. They had difficulties with speech, comprehension, and social interaction. Medical institutions at the time did not have a name for this, but the aristocracy knew what to do: distance. In 1941, both sisters were transferred to the Royal Earlswood Hospital, an institution for people with intellectual disabilities. What could have been an opportunity for care soon turned into a tool for systematic oblivion. Their names began to disappear from family archives. Official genealogical biographies published in the 1950s declared them dead. Nerisa in 1940, Catherine in 1961. They didn't even bother to hide the deception with any subtlety. They wrote only what was necessary to avoid questions. For more than 40 years, the two sisters lived in a gray institution, sharing routines and walls but receiving no visitors. The nurses said that letters with the royal coat of arms almost never reached them. Imagine a photograph taken in the 1980s showing a girl named Nerisa. She stares into the void, her hands folded on her knees. The outside world did not know who she was, and this was no accident. It was a policy of silence, of managing invisibility. Nerisa and others like her were not simply isolated. They were erased from memory, turned into faceless numbers, bodies without a history. Decades later, thanks to a courageous article by a journalist, the truth about this forgotten corner of the palace came to light. What was discovered was not a legal crime, but a moral one. Punishment for being born different from what was expected. It is a reminder that even in the modern world, ancestry can be more important than life itself. The story of Alexandrina of Prussia, born in 1915, granddaughter of Kaiser Wilhelm II, unfolds on the edge of private love and public neglect. From an early age, Alexandrina was diagnosed with mental retardation, probably Down syndrome, but her parents decided not to send her to an institution, but to raise her in the imperial household. She appears in several photographs, but always in the background, with her eyes downcast. Her life was like a room with boarded-up windows. She was in the castle, but she was not part of the powerful scene. Alexandrina attended a special school, was surrounded by care, and, according to records, was loved by her family. But her name was never mentioned at official events. Her birthdays were not covered in the press, and she herself remained unnoticed outside the family walls. Alexandrina passed away in 1980. There are no biographies with her name on the cover, but those who have studied her life describe her as a symbol of quiet love, a tragic balance between private acceptance and public denial. She was a presence that was allowed, but not acknowledged. Now let us remember Anne de Gaulle, born in 1928, daughter of General Charles de Gaulle. Her story is no less sad, but completely different. Anne was born with Down syndrome into a family that was not royal, but very public. Unlike the previous examples, her parents did not try to hide her. She grew up at home, and her father, known for his military strictness, showed unusual tenderness when he was with her. It was said that the general did not speak to Anne with words, but communicated through caresses. However, Anna's condition never became part of the de Gaulle family's public image. She did not appear at official events, there were no press releases, and no family photos were published. Love existed, but in a closed space, as if it needed walls to protect the image of the leader. Anna passed away at the age of 20 in 1948 from pneumonia. Her death was a real tragedy for the family. Anna's mother, Yvonne, founded an institution for girls with disabilities in her honor. In this place, hundreds of girls found a home, a school, and an opportunity for the future. Anna's story did not end with her passing. It continued in the care of others. This was perhaps the most striking act of social redemption among all these stories. Looking at these three stories, it becomes clear not only the difference in approaches, but also a common pattern of exclusion. Nerisa and Catherine were erased from memory. Alexandrina remained on the sidelines, and Anna was loved in secret. 3 decisions, 3 types of exile, all arising from one fear, the fear that difference would destroy the myth of hereditary perfection. Behind each name lie other forgotten stories of princes who never made it into portraits, daughters who never crossed the halls, children who breathed behind walls but never stepped on royal carpets. Sometimes, violence is not necessary to disappear. It is enough simply not to be mentioned. These 3 stories prompt us not only to feel compassion, but also to ask ourselves, how many more such fates remain unnoticed? How many people are still waiting for someone to say, "You were also part of this world"? Even before clinical diagnoses and debates about inclusion, fear already existed, a deep, almost sacred fear of anything that disrupts symmetry. In ancient civilizations, differences were not perceived through the prism of science, but as symbols. A child who did not look into the eyes, did not react like the others, born with distinctive features, was perceived not simply as special, but as a crack in the cosmic order. In ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh was considered not just a ruler, but the embodiment of a god. Harmony was the law. The principle of Maat, reflecting the divine order, was manifested in everything from the architecture of temples to the ideal body of the ruler. If an heir was born with a physical defect, it was perceived as a heavenly discrepancy. Imagine a world where the life and death of children were decided not by the will of the gods, but by the whims of their parents. In ancient Rome, for example, the fate of a newborn depended on the pater familias, the head of the family. If he picked up the child, it was accepted into the family. If not, it was left to the mercy of fate, on the steps of a temple or on the banks of the Tiber. This practice, known as exposure, was not only common but also legal. It was used not only because of poverty but also to correct family mistakes. The Roman philosopher Seneca even justified such actions, arguing that by killing monsters at birth, they were acting not out of cruelty but out of compassion. In his view, a life full of flaws did not deserve suffering. And what happened in Sparta, where the cult of the body was paramount? There the elders carefully examined each newborn. If a child appeared weak or different from the norm, it was thrown off Mount Taygetus. This was not considered punishment, but was perceived as purification. In Spartan society, where military power was paramount, any deviation was perceived as a threat to the common good. The polis had to be invincible, and this began at birth. In Babylon, however, differences were perceived differently, through the prism of rituals. Clay tablets mention children who were sacrificed to the god Nergal, the patron of the underworld. These sacred ceremonies may have concealed sacrifices aimed at restoring the cosmic order. In a society where ancestry was supposed to reflect the perfection of the heavens, a child with genetic abnormalities could be a bad omen. They were eliminated not because of weakness, but because of fear of a possible collapse of legitimacy. And in ancient Japan, before the influence of Buddhism and Confucianism, there were mysterious children known as Kodomo no Shuri. They were considered to be links to other worlds. Some of them had physical or behavioral differences. Instead of integrating such children into society, they were left in shrines under the protection of forest kami. The community did not kill them, but did not recognize them as full-fledged people. They returned to the other world, sometimes with offerings, sometimes without. In the Andes, archaeologists have found the remains of children with deformities buried in ritual poses, surrounded by ceramics and textiles. Some anthropologists suggest that they were chosen as children of the sun, sacrificed to ensure good harvests. Here, differences were not hidden, but elevated to a pedestal. But the outcome was the same: disappearance. In medieval Europe, silence became more systematic. In castles, the birth of children was a public event, but only if it went smoothly. If a newborn had defects, the priest quietly performed the baptismal rite, and the body was taken away without ceremony. Some private records mention that the angel returned to heaven without opening his eyes. This was a euphemism concealing the true state of affairs. In Byzantium, emperors were chosen by God himself, but even they were not protected from human judgment. Chronicles mention children who died before they could be named. Some historians believe that such children were removed from church records by order of the church. The archives of a monastery on Mount Athos contain manuscripts that mention children without mothers who were sent away from noble families in Constantinople. A recurring phrase reads, "He will be raised in silence." Nothing more. What unites all these cultures? Not methods, but fear. Fear of disrupting the order, of visible weakness, of condemnation by the gods or the people. A child who was different from others was too human for a throne that was supposed to seem eternal. Today, historians are trying to reconstruct what has been erased from memory. They search for traces in letters, in nameless gravestones, in rituals that were not understood. But the main obstacle is not the lack of evidence, but the desire to forget. For centuries, history was written by those who decided what should be remembered. Thousands of children born into golden cradles were condemned to anonymity because their bodies did not fit the ideal of divinity. We often do not know the names of those who remained in the shadows of history, but their presence is felt in every corner, in every untold story. Look at the world around you, how our perception of people with Down syndrome has changed. It used to be something that was hidden, whispered about. Today, we see these children not as harbingers of doom, but as a whole world of possibilities. But how did we come to this understanding? It did not happen overnight. It was a long and difficult journey, full of struggle and overcoming obstacles. For centuries, differences were perceived as something shameful. However, modern medicine has opened our eyes. Down syndrome is not a curse or a moral punishment, but a genetic variation caused by the presence of an extra chromosome, the 21st. It is not a sentence, but part of the diversity of human life that deserves respect and care. Indeed, in recent decades, we have witnessed significant changes. In different parts of the world, children with Down syndrome attend regular schools. Some even go to university, work, and become actors. For example, in Argentina, a young girl named Sofia became the first model with Down syndrome to walk the runway at New York Fashion Week. And in Spain, actor Pablo Pineda became the first European with this condition to obtain a university degree. However, despite these successes, the shadows of the past have not yet disappeared. In some countries, prenatal diagnosis is used to justify almost systematic termination of pregnancy. In Iceland, for example, statistics show that 100% of pregnancies diagnosed with Down syndrome end in abortion. In France, this figure exceeds 95%. In some hospitals, doctors do not explain what life with this condition might look like, offering only a quick solution disguised as healthcare. The words have changed, but the logic remains dangerously familiar. Better not to have than to suffer. But who really suffers? The child or the adults who don't know how to look at them without fear? Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, thousands of families deprived of resources and support are raising their children without access to therapy and inclusive education. This divide is not only genetic, but also social, cultural, and economic. Therefore, remembering cases from the past is not simply nostalgia or an accusation against those who have passed away. It is a mirror reminding us that exclusion can take many forms. Sometimes it is dressed in a white coat, sometimes it speaks in the name of love, and sometimes it acts out of fear of the unknown. The external forms have changed, but the roots remain. Contemporary visibility should not be seen as a final victory. It is only one step on a long journey. Awareness campaigns, foundations, inclusive schools, TV series with actors with disabilities, all of these are important. But nothing can replace the simplest and most powerful human gesture, looking with respect, not pity, not fear, but understanding. And of course, to name them. After all, those who do not have a name do not exist. Today, many children who in the past might have ended up in closed institutions are now appearing on magazine covers, on social media, and in fashion campaigns. They are not anomalies. They are symbols of change, proof that the world can change. Every time one of them smiles at the camera, reads a poem in public, or simply walks with their parents in the park without feeling judged, we witness a small act of historical justice. It is a gesture that says, "I am here, and I have always been here." And perhaps, in this hard-won visibility, we can begin to write a future in which no child is forced to live in silence, where differences do not mean distance, and where history is written not only from the perspective of power, but also from the perspective of love and understanding. Telling these stories means not only remembering the past, but also creating a space for the present, where everyone has the right to their name and place in history. Imagine how, in the shadows of majestic castles and shining crowns, there are stories that no one talks about. These are not just fairy tales about princes and princesses, but profound reflections on what it means to be human. When we talk about dignity, what do we mean? Is it talent, beauty, intelligence, or is it simply the right to live, to feel, to be heard? Think about how entire cultures decide who is worthy of love and care and who is not. We often forget that behind the glitz of empires and coats of arms lie empty rooms, unpainted portraits, and cribs left without joy and laughter. These losses are not just facts of history, they are wounds that society considers necessary. For what? For the throne, for family honor, for fear of condemnation. Returning to these forgotten stories, we begin to ask ourselves important questions. How many times have we, without wearing crowns, remained silent in the face of differences? How many times has the word inclusion remained just a nice phrase rather than a real practice? True evolution is not found in loud speeches and actions, but in simple gestures. In a classroom that opens its doors, in a doctor who looks with understanding, in a neighbor who offers support. And so the question is not what we did wrong in the past, but what we are willing to do today. We can simply acknowledge that injustice has occurred, or we can become active participants in change. Remembering Nerisa, Catherine, Alexandrine, and Anna is not just a tribute, it is a way of saying, this is no longer acceptable. Their stories, though incomplete, give us a moral compass. No origin or merit justifies neglect. Humanity is not measured by standards of perfection, but by the ability to care for the most vulnerable. If a system of power, whatever it may be, is built on the silence of a child, it is not greatness, but cowardice. To name names is to acknowledge. To acknowledge is to restore. To restore is to start again, with new questions and a new heart. If we can preserve this memory, we will have nothing to hide, because we will understand that there is no nobler legacy than compassion. We cannot change the past. We cannot open closed doors or paint unfinished portraits. But we can do something more powerful. Remember them with respect and intention. And in doing so, we not only give them a place in our memory, but we also find our own place in the history we want to create. True civilization is not measured by monuments or wealth, but by how it treats its most vulnerable, how it responds to differences, and how it chooses to defend or remain silent. Today, you have a choice. You can leave this history behind or take it with you. You can discuss it with your loved ones, your children, your friends. Use your voice to speak about what others prefer to keep silent. Turn memory into an act of love. You don't have to be an activist or an expert. It's enough to simply look differently, listen, support, ask questions without fear, defend without shame, and rejoice unconditionally. If you've come this far, it means that something in this story has touched you. Maybe you recognize someone, maybe you saw yourself, or maybe you just believe that things can be different. Don't leave it here. Let's break this cycle of silence that has gone on for too long. Let no life be hidden behind the frame. Let no difference be a cause for shame. Let history be written not only from the perspective of perfection, but also from the perspective of truth. Because every child with or without Down syndrome deserves to be seen, loved, and remembered. Imagine that one day, thanks to a simple gesture of kindness, a lonely child receives a warm hug instead of cold indifference. Isn't that worth all the effort? This idea runs through the entire history of humanity because it is moments like these that can change destinies. Let us remember how, at the beginning of the 20th century, in the harsh conditions of city life, many children were left without support and care. At that time, charitable organizations emerged that sought to help those in need. For example, in 1901, the first children's colony was founded in St. Petersburg, where children could not only receive an education, but also feel care and love. Each of us can become part of this story because kindness and attention to others are what make us human. When we hug someone, we don't just convey warmth, we create a bond that can change lives. And if even one child feels needed and loved, then all our efforts have not been in vain.